So I'm Jeff Lerman. I'm part of QIAGEN now, which is a life sciences company. I will be talking about the ontology that we use for organizing biomedical information that we curate from a variety of sources, and I'll talk about why we do that and how we do that. I actually started when I started, I wasn't working for QIAGEN. I was working for Ingenuity Systems, which is a bioinformatics firm, and that was acquired a couple years ago by QIAGEN, which has a broader scope. So I might be flipping back and forth between talking about Ingenuity and QIAGEN, but it's all the, in some sense, the same company. All right, so QIAGEN has a biomedical ontology. And I'm going to sort of run through for you what we are able to do with that ontology, where we use it, the requirements that we have in order for it to be useful for us, what it looks like, how we build it, and by building it I mean structurally and in terms of the content. I'm going to be somewhat light on the software implementation details. I'll take questions on that at the end, but this is going to be more of a informatics set of questions rather than the software implementation per se. And how we do quality control on the content, which for us is very important. So I'll start with some examples of the kinds of questions that we can answer with the ontology that we have. And so one might be, I want to get a list of all lung diseases that aren't cancers. So we get about 200 plus results from a question like that. And they range from we can read these, right? Good. OK. They range from things that you might more or less consider to be obvious, bronchitis. And by the way, for each of our classes or objects, if you will, we have descriptions that are internal for us, but that help us sort of reflect the meaning or know what we're talking about and what the meaning of these concepts are. So inflammation of part of the lung, infectious lung disease, this is kind of a high-level classifier, and we get into some less obvious things that you might not think of immediately when asked the initial questions. So fungal pneumonia, berylliosis, which is a particular kind of essentially poisoning that affects the lung, and a whole range of other things that get sort of less and less obvious. And these are easy to gather in the ontology. So a more sophisticated question, or at least a more complicated question, would be to list the active clinical trials, so currently active clinical trials for drugs that treat cancer in patients that have mutations in BRAF. So BRAF is a gene. And there might be particular drugs, it turns out there are particular drugs, that are in testing and some level of testing to treat cancer in patients that have that are indicated for patients that have mutations specifically in that gene. So we run this query recently, we got 175 results over a collection of 5 unique drugs, and I've just listed some examples here. So in order to do that, we have to have models for a number of different concepts within this sentence. And I'm not going to talk about sort of the mapping of a sentence like this, because I know in a conference like this, there's a lot of interest in mapping sort of natural language, obviously, to structured language. And I'm not going to focus on that particular mapping for a sentence like this. We would pose a question like this in terms of a query language directly. So nonetheless, we want to know about the concept of drugs. We want to know about which of those drugs treat cancer. So in order to know that, we have to know about, we have to have a full list of drug approvals from some agency or agencies. And specifically within those drug approvals, we need to know what the drugs are approved for. We want to know some details of those drug indications, or what drugs are approved for, in order to cover this restriction, patients that have this particular kind of mutation. And specifically for those indications, it's not enough just for us to have descriptions. We want the gene or the mutation to be broken out in a structured way. And then finally, we need to know what does it mean for there to be an active clinical trial. So we need to know, we have to have a full list of clinical trials. We need to know which ones are active. We need to know which ones are for which drugs. So that's a bunch of different areas of knowledge that we have to be able to tie together. So, and we can, as you can see, we can do that with the structure that we have and with the collection of knowledge that we have. So Ingenuity now, as I said, QIAGEN makes software to contextualize molecular biology and genomics data sets. So the general idea, the sort of overarching principle, is that we're aligning customer data to the world of relevant biological knowledge in order to give insight into the meaning of what would otherwise be raw and perhaps uninformative data. So we're facilitating insight into existing knowledge, and the inference is powered using multiple individual, what you might call facts, what we prefer to refer to as findings or assertions. We're not making a judgment as to truth, but we are making a judgment as to what things are said by whom. And I have a couple of examples of main software products that still bear the Ingenuity name. One of them is called Ingenuity Pathway Analysis. It's been around for quite a while now. And that's looking at the interrelationships of, or looking at biochemical pathways and how they interact and how genes play a role in those pathways, speaking at a high level. And a newer one is Ingenuity Variant Analysis, and the focus there is to look at genetic variations, or what you might, what people would refer to as mutations, perhaps. And specifically to be able to filter lists of genetic variants in particular cases, in particular patients, to isolate what might be likely causal variants for a particular problem that patient's presenting with. So in order to be able to do that, to sort of serve as the underpinning for this kind of software, we have a number of requirements. So one is the knowledge has to be organized in a way that's accurate. It has to be highly accurate. We have a very low tolerance for outright mistakes. And we need to be able to confirm, obviously, that accuracy. So we need to have a framework that's highly testable. Things need to be normalized. So will be not surprising to people here. So one way that we mean that is that we want to be able to map synonyms to a concept. So we're modeling concepts, but we want to have all the tags or many of the terms that are used to refer to those concepts, so that we can recognize across different data sources, of course, that a term is referring to the same thing. We also, at a somewhat higher level, need to be able to map different syntactic structures to the same meaning. So if someone's referring to inflammation of meninges or inflammation of meninx, we need, and there's more, we need to be able to know that that means the same thing, and there are extensions past that where we also have to, even when the semantic structures are different, we still need to be able to recognize that we're talking about the same thing. So for example, there may be a process, a biological process that results in some property of a cell being increased. And so one person might say, I observed in scientific literature, I observed an increase in that process. I observed an increase in programmed cell death, or in term of art is apoptosis. Another person might say, meaning the exact same thing, I observed an increase in apoptotic cells. So these are, it just means cells that are undergoing this process. Different semantic structures, we need to know that those are equivalent. And so we need to be able to tie those things together. Needs to be sophisticated enough to be useful. We need to be able to do inference across different kinds of statements, statements with different kinds of structures. Sort of simple example, A causes B to bind to C. The result of that, so BC binding, increases some other process D. So we need to be able to infer, or want to be able to infer, down a chain like that. So A increases D. And so that requires us to have some kind of a unified model for statements, even when there are a variety, and including a variety of kinds of statements. So in addition, we want to be able, we want something that is efficiently extensible. We need to be able to add new relationship types fairly easily. So I've listed some examples of the kind of relations that we record here. Physical part of, implicit locations, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Whether something has a particular mutation. So within the ontology, we have a variety of different kinds of concepts. We have physical things at a variety of scales. We have to be able to talk about what we call temporal things or processes, so diseases or other pathological processes, as well as just general biological processes. And other kinds of things as well, both properties, which might modify some of those physical or temporal things, but also we need models for statements themselves, for metadata, how we know a particular thing, where a particular assertion came from, as well as definitions, both in the purely text-based sense for the use internally to help us communicate internally, but also to be able to tie different kinds of assertions to each other and bind that equivalence. So in addition to those kinds of concepts, we also have a list of types of relationships. The most frequently seen kind of relationship is the is-a relationship, so something that is more specific than something else. Cancer is a disease. Other examples, physical part of, finger is a part of hand, Chicago is part of Illinois, or at a different kind of level, a definitional agent. So bacterial infection, we want to be able to infer, or we want to know that by definition, bacterial infection is caused by bacteria. And there are a variety of other kinds of definitional relationships that we can infer to make explicit the relationships, the fact that some concepts can be described in terms of other concepts that we know about. So the first list of things we model as classes. The second list we model as things we call that are called slots. We also have instances of classes, and so there's specific references to each of these things. And then finally, we can talk about scalar values. So strings are the most frequently seen example, but also numbers, Booleans, and we can talk about sets of items as well. So we use a frame-based ontology. And so all of the first kinds of things are recorded as what we'll refer to as frames, and what are referred to in a frame-based ontology as frames. So this goes back, I guess the first example of, or the first description of a frame-based ontology was in the 70s. by Marvin Minsky. Our ontology was developed about 15 years ago. And so after there had been considerable discussion about this, but anyway, we've found this to be a very effective model for our use. So here are some examples of how we organize things in this ontology. So we started at a pretty high level, say physical thing, and within that we might have anatomical part, and we have, so the gray, excellent. So the gray items here are classes. The lines between them will be slots, and I'll color code the slots for the different kinds of, for each different type of slot that I'll be referring to, we'll get a different color code. So these red arrows will be is-a. Moving down to something more specific, we have the hippocampus, might also have the brain. Those are both anatomical parts. They also, as you might know, have another kind of relationship. So the hippocampus is also a part of the brain. So we would denote that as a physical part of relationship. And then there are temporal things. So disease is a temporal thing or is a process. Cancer is a kind of disease. Brain cancer is a kind of cancer. And we can denote relationships across these kinds of high-level distinctions or high-level areas as appropriate. So brain cancer obviously has a relationship to brain. We would call that an implicit location. So in that way, we can gather all of the processes, for example, that would be anticipated to occur, or be limited to occur, I should say, in a particular place. And know, for example, that an assertion that such a process was occurring somewhere else would be in error. Another feature, so we have multiple inheritance. So brain cancer, in addition to being a kind of cancer, is also a kind of brain disorder. Both of those are diseases. So finally, we have, in addition to physical and temporal things, we have what we call information-based things. And among those are findings, or these assertions that we might curate from the world. We have kinds of findings. We have a restricted set of kinds of findings. We add to it as needed, but it all falls within a unified model. So one of those kinds of findings might be a disease association finding. Here's an example of something like that. So we might see, we might have a finding that, although it isn't structured as simple text like this, we can generate text reflecting the meaning of this finding. Some mutant human gene, in this case MSH2 is the name of the gene, and we know the particular mutation, and this is a particular jargon that you'll be familiar with if you're familiar with genetic mutations, but suffice to say that this describes a particular genetic variant. Some particular mutated gene has been observed with brain cancer in human. There might be additional metadata telling us more about who said this, how many humans, but this by itself is already a kind of assertion. We would model this as an instance itself of disease association finding. So the type of this instance is disease association finding. But within that instance is built of instances of a variety of other classes, right? So there would be an instance of brain cancer that was used for this finding. It would be used uniquely in this finding. So statements themselves are objects in the ontology, both statement types and statements themselves. In order to put this together, as I mentioned earlier, there are a bunch of different sources that we, or certainly a bunch of different kinds of information that we need to be able to gather. And we pull that from a variety of sources, and we have a variety of techniques that is not as long a list as the variety of sources, but we do encounter different kinds of workflows that we need to implement depending on characteristics of the source. So roughly one way to think of these is that sources range from being highly structured, where we can pretty much automate the process because A, they're structured, and B, we trust their structure, to things that are totally unstructured. And I'll give some examples of each and talk about how we deal with those. So some examples of what we consider to be adequately and accurately structured sources are these things called Ontology, or OMIM. So Ontology is the National Library of Medicine's database of genes. We focus largely on human genes, although not entirely. But Ontology itself is a resource that covers many organisms. And we collect from not only the list of genes and the terms that are used to describe those genes, but a variety of other characteristics. And that is pretty much doable with in an automated process where we can more or less trigger a script on a periodic basis and stay up to date on that kind of data. A slightly less structured resource, but one for which the structure that it does have is adequate to our current needs, is OMIM, which stands for the Online Mendelian Inheritance in Man, I think. Database, and this is a database at Johns Hopkins University that relates genes to disease. There's a lot of unstructured data in this database, but as I said, the elements that are most useful, or I should say it's useful enough at the level at which it's structured for us to be able to also automate import from something like that. So at the other end of the spectrum, we have what we would consider to be completely unstructured sources, so peer-reviewed articles in the literature. Obviously a very rich source, but highly unstructured. Or if it has structure, a given instance has structure, the structure is inconsistent, which is just as bad. So for that, we have a completely manual process. And so this is obviously expensive, but it bears, it allows us to curate very sophisticated content. We have trained scientists. So first of all, we point scientists at the problem, but second of all, we have a protocol that we developed that they are trained on and tested on before we sort of let them loose on this process. They have a curation tool that they use to align their work and to sort of facilitate what they're doing with the ontology. And so when they are curating findings, statements that we have told them via the protocol are the kind that are of interest to us, they can map them, or they can see what terms map to the ontology. And if something doesn't map, but they know that it's the right kind of statement, it also gives them a way to request a new term in the ontology. So there's a sort of a semi-manual or semi-automated relationship between, or workflow, I should say, that allows the ontology to grow and adapt as needed. So that's that's relatively slow and expensive, but we get very high quality content, and it's really currently the only way to get that level of sophistication from unstructured data. And in the middle we have, or somewhere in the middle, we have a variety of sources that I'll call semi-structured. And so for these we have semi-automated imports. So we have an automated portion of the import, but it's assisted by some manual process. Either we clean up the data on the way in, we notice on an automated basis that there are issues or potential issues, and sort of provide a patch layer for the data before we import it. Or we might use a process to understand at a basic level, here are the documents from that database that we know are of interest. We know that the data in them is not structured, so that at least allows us to go ahead and point curators at those particular documents rather than the entire corpus. Examples of those databases, one of them, interestingly to me, is the clinical trials database. So this is a quite large database of probably over 120, maybe 150,000 records, and growing at something like 50 or 60 records a day, every day, of clinical trials that are either currently open at some stage or have been completed in some way for some reason. Either they were terminated because they weren't going well, or they finished and they did go well, or somewhere in between. So this is a database of records that are retrievable in XML form, and certainly there's a lot of structure there. What we find, however, is that structure an allegation of structure, I should say, per se, isn't really always enough. And so this is a case where we see, when we look at the data, we see that the actual text or the actual content in each of those elements is not always that well controlled. Certainly, there's a controlled vocabulary for parts of it, but not for other parts. There may be errors, there may be outright errors, or there may be sort of more subtle errors. We can detect a lot of those things by comparing effectively what we're reading from that data to what we already have in the ontology or in the knowledge base. And so for something like that, we have this automated import process, but then we maintain a long list of patches against the data to resolve issues that are there, but that we don't anticipate are going to be fixed by the data owners. And who actually owns that data is another sort of complicated story. Another area of sort of semi-structured data are Fda drug labels. So Fda drug labels are generated when FDA approves a drug for a particular indication or indications. And they do have structure, but it's sort of at a very high level. And in order to get the really useful stuff, we essentially have to identify the labels of interest and send them for some kind of manual curation. So finally, we have another kind of issue, which are what I'll call sophisticated but unreliable sources. So disease databases are an example. So we use disease databases not so much for individual observations, but as sources to help us with our terminology and with the ontology structure itself. Which diseases are a type of which other disease, and how are they related? And in those cases, diseases being sort of at a conceptual level, something that's not really very well defined. It obviously has a definition, but it's somewhat flexible. And it's certainly flexible and changes over time in particular cases. So not surprisingly, because of that, we find that basically all of the databases out there, including the ones that are structured as ontologies, suffer from a variety of problems that are difficult to detect, at a minimum difficult to detect automatically. And so those might include missing relationships, duplication, outright sort of errors of commission, inconsistency, internal inconsistencies. So in order to deal with that, we basically don't use those sorts of databases as sources for the ontology. So the ontology structure and the class structure is essentially manually built and maintained as a result. And we use things like these as guides, and they certainly accelerate and facilitate the process. But we found that we aren't able in this regime to just take, even for a particular branch of the ontology or part of the ontology, an external ontology and use it as is. We have found that it's much more effective not to do that, and instead to use them, as I say, as guides, but in an essentially manual process. And so, yeah, so as I say here, we use both in-house experts, scientists, as well as internal consistency tests in the ontology itself to detect those kinds of errors. So we don't rely completely on people looking everything over, but because we are maintaining an ontology, we can see internal inconsistencies, and those can be flagged for corrections. In order to, I also mentioned that the content has to be testable. So we have a long list of tests against the content, and those are also encoded within the ontology itself. And so we have a list of different test types that are sort of pre-cooked, as it were, as well as the ability to write more sophisticated one-off tests. So in that first category, we have, for example, we can restrict slot values to a particular type. So we might know that the name of something has to be a string, or that implicit location is meant to point to a class, that is, to a concept, rather than a string or a number. Or slot values at the finding level should be pointing to instances. We restrict cardinality of slot values. Slots have to have, we can say maximum or minimum or exact numbers. We can restrict multiple inheritance, so that in that way we can indicate that things like properties and temporal things or processes are mutually exclusive. There should never be a class that can be both. So that's sort of sanity testing. And then we can control string values via regular expression matching. At the somewhat more complex level, we can do things like prohibit duplicate findings. So if there's a finding with the same structure, we can recurse down into those, into each finding and ensure that we don't have two findings that duplicate each other. We can test the consistency, as I've mentioned once or twice, of class modeling using properties on the classes. So if we know that we have a class brain cancer and it's defined as a cancer of the brain, we know that that should be we can tell that that should be a subclass of cancer, and if it's not, we have an error somewhere, and it should be a subclass of brain disease. And that's possible because the definitions of some of these classes with respect to each other, or the respect to other classes. There are over 9,000 constraints overall, and they vary in scope. We run those nightly over the ontology, and that helps us keep things clean. So I will end there. I want to acknowledge a few people. So the Ingenuity was co-founded by Ramon Feliciano. Ramon and Tony Lozer were the authors of the Ingenuity Knowledge Representation System. So this is all implemented in Icarus, we call it. Icarus itself is implemented in Java. And that happened now 15 years ago. And so it's been developed since then. Corey Cook does the heads up, I should say, the development and maintenance of Icarus. Sarah Tannenbaum is our director of content, and Kaushal Parekh is the ontology group manager. I myself am in the ontology group, which is in the content part of the company. And that's my contact info, and I will take questions.
Yeah, so you guys are not using RDF, Docker, or and stuff like that?
Right. So this is a frame-based ontology. Those are description logic. I mean, it's a different way of representing an ontology. So the short answer is no, we're not. But we found that frame-based ontology is much more useful for us. It allows us to be explicit about what belongs to what rather than defining rules for where instances should go. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
So I was hesitant to talk about how do you use all this knowledge?
Very carefully. So the knowledge base is basically used to drive a variety of software products for the most part. And those software products have in common, sort of as a common theme, this idea that we're giving customers tools to align their own data with the state of biological knowledge, and in that way get an understanding of what their data mean. Well, it's allowing people to get insight, right? So it's a tool to give people context, sort of see what why a particular list of genes might be showing up in their assay as being important in some disease. Like, we can tell you, oh, that list of genes is representative of a particular biological pathway. So what you're really seeing is that this disease must interrupt that pathway in some way. So that's a sort of a simple and older kind of example, but we can also take a lot of this data, put it together, and we use it for molecular diagnostics. So they're in a variety of different ways, but the idea is to understand if you have a genetic test for someone who's got a particular disease phenotype, and the genetic test comes back, and it's sort of the raw data at some level of raw data that others can address more and have addressed more. But the raw data is be a list of genetic variants. Well, which of those variants is relevant to their disease? Which ones should I be looking at? And what might they be telling me about potential treatment options for that patient? So that's an example of bringing to bear like sort of the state of biological knowledge to understand like what otherwise would be pretty dry data.
So it's mostly research.
Well, no, I mean, it includes research, and it's certainly used, for example, in the area of drug development, but in as much as we talk about the diagnosis case or cases, there are a handful of use cases where it's directly relevant to patients. So it's not directly available to patients. It's this sort of software, for example, would facilitate a company's work, a molecular diagnostic company's work. So if someone, the workflow would go something like this. Someone gets sick, they go to a doctor, the doctor orders a genetic sequencing test. The test order is filled by one of these companies, and the company is charged with providing a report. But what the company gets initially, more or less initially, is a list of mutations. And the doctor isn't interested in a list of mutations. The doctor needs a list of mutations along with their potential significance, from this mutation is irrelevant to this mutation is likely to be relevant to the cause and is informative in terms of telling us what treatment options might be useful for that patient. So, yeah.
It actually brings the question, so how the users actually ask questions to the system? You mentioned a query language.
Yeah.
So that's how they will write the query themselves? Or?
So the query language, right. So from the perspective of users, so currently we don't make the knowledge base available sort of in its raw form externally. Instead, it's used to power applications. And so in practice, what we do is that the knowledge is represented and maintained and developed in Icarus. but then we export views of it, basically in what amounts to tabular form. So we export the results of certain queries. Those get fed into relational databases, and those, because they perform more quickly, are used to power the applications. And so, however, if depending on the use case, if a customer were to come to us with a particular question that wasn't the sort of thing that an application would have the answer to, we can certainly write queries against the knowledge base, and do that in the course of development. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks very much.